Let's put this all together. So let's put it, we know what MEVs, MRVs, maintenance volume. So do we train at the MRV most of the time because it's like the best, or MAV most of the time because it's the best? How do we put all of these landmarks together in a training program, and how, if we know them, or if we are assume that we know them?
Sure. So keep in mind, everything I'm about to say, very speculative. It's very hypothetical. It's based on studies that aren't designed to test for this. It's based on inferences. So essentially, we take studies on certain topics and we say, okay, so this happens, so maybe this is going to happen. So everything I'm about to say, very speculative. I wouldn't be surprised if, for example, training at MAV all the time was just as effective or more effective than training from MEV to MRV. That being said, you can make a decent case based on the available evidence that training from MEV to MRV is a good idea. Essentially, when you're done with the training cycle, you've taken a deload, you've dropped fatigue, your muscles have resensitized to training to some extent. You likely don't need that much volume to progress in terms of building muscle mass. So training at MEV is just fine. It also allows you to minimize injury risk, because the less training you do, the less injury risk you get. The more you expose yourself to training hard, training heavy, etc., the more your injury risk goes up. And so because you're going to be training for, say, 4 to 8 weeks anyways, you might as well take the easy weeks fast, minimize injury risk, and minimize fatigue buildup so you can have a long, productive mesocycle. So starting around MEV is a good idea. And then week to week, we have some evidence now showing that increasing volume compared to what you were doing before likely increases muscle growth. So we have one direct study, for example, which was released, I think, in the past year now, where they had 2 groups. One group, they just assigned a set amount of volume, which is, I think, like 10 sets a week. And the other group, they asked them, okay, how many sets were you doing before we started the study? And they told them. And then instead of just giving them 10 sets, for example, they told them, okay, you're going to do this amount of volume plus 20%. And the group that was assigned to the plus 20% volume amount grew more than the group that was just doing a set amount of volume, a random amount of volume, essentially. So it does seem that increasing volume, at least to some extent, in some time frame, increases how much muscle growth you can get, at least provided you can recover. And so we have some rationale for increasing volume week to week. And also there's stuff like the overload principle, which is a very broad principle, but it might be relevant to. And so week to week, because also volume has one of the most causal and linear relationships with muscle growth out of most variables, up to an extent, of course. And, you know, if you do so much that you can't recover, then that's not good. But within a certain range, it has a pretty good relationship with growth, more so than, say, proximity to failure or frequency or intensity. So it seems like if we're going to manipulate any variable, volume seems like the one to go with. And so week to week, we increase volume, and eventually we go into MAV, so maximally adaptive volume, which is where you get likely the most growth. And then because we want to keep increasing volume relative to last week, provided you cover, of course, then we eventually reach MRV. And around that time, training fatigue and psychological fatigue, I think psychological fatigue is often understated when people talk about this. At the end of a hard training mesocycle, while your performance can technically recover session to session, and that might indicate that you're physiologically recovered, psychologically, when you've been doing hard training and hard training and hard training and hard training and hard training for weeks and weeks and weeks, at some point you start disliking training, and at some point it's not going to be your performance that's lagging behind, it's your motivation to train anymore. So at the end of the mesocycle, you reach MRV, and training at MRV isn't very sustainable, largely because of psychological factors, but also because of physiological factors. So at some point, your performance is going to lag behind, and you're not going to be able to keep training productively. And so you hit MRV, and you can exceed MRV for maybe a week or two at a time and functionally overreach, and then you're going to have to deload.
You said
there's
week.
No way to... a week or two, perhaps, yes.
A week or two, okay.
Yep. And then that's called functional overreaching, which is essentially when you go above what you can recover from for a short amount of time, and then you deload or you take a period of reduced training. so that then the supercompensation can occur and you get essentially the adaptations you didn't get back then because you weren't fully recovering. So yeah, that's essentially why we progress from MEV to MRV. It's because it makes sense in the grand scheme of things. It does have some practical implications, like it takes more time. It's a little bit more stressful to plan out. It can be difficult to fit into your lifestyle. For example, if you've got exams coming up and it's MRV week or it's like overreaching week, that might not be ideal. And so for some people, just having static sets can be a lot better. But if you want to optimize things for hypertrophy, I think it makes some sense.